Submit to arrest. You cannot resist. This was the message to protesters delivered by NYPD Commissioner Bill Bratton in an interview with WNYC's Brian Layer last August. You'll remember that it was the month before, in July, when Eric Garner, an unarmed black man, was killed after being placed in a police chokehold, which led to public protests and the commissioner's warning. And now, Bratton hopes to double down on this message with his support of a legislative proposal that would increase the penalty for resisting arrest from a misdemeanor to a felony. But others say that this change has the potential to become a question of civil rights. Joining us to break down these issues is Noel Leader, a former NYPD sergeant and founder of 100 Blacks in Law Enforcement Who Care. Thank you so much, Noel, for being here.
Thank you.
We also have Martin Stoller, who's an attorney with the National Lawyers Guild's National Police Accountability Project. I also want to welcome you to BK Live.
Thank you.
And we have, coming back to BK Live, Brooklyn civil rights attorney Andrew Stoll of Stoll, Glickman, and Bellina. But first, let's welcome via phone New York State Senator Tony Avella, a Democrat from Queens, who is the sponsor of the proposed legislation in the Senate. He will join us a little bit later. So let me just go ahead and start with my panel. Resisting arrest. It's a tacked-on charge that's typically a misdemeanor. Generally, the maximum penalty is about up to 1 year in prison. Now we're looking at making this a felony. What are some of the problems with this proposal? I want to start with you first, Andrew.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's a classic blaming the victim move. It's addressing an epidemic of police misconduct, and it's the wrong way to address an epidemic of police misconduct. It's like if you were addressing an epidemic of robberies on the street and you made it illegal to wear expensive jewelry on the street. We have communities of people who are being falsely arrested, illegally searched, illegally seized every single day. And the way to address that problem is to address the policing, not to address the people who are suffering these indignities in our communities every day.
Those who support this measure say that by enforcing resisting arrest charges, for example, it keeps not only the police officers safe, but the subjects with who they are arresting. It keeps them safe from excessive force and things of that nature if you just submit to arrest. No, you were a former police officer. Please tell me, in your situation that you encountered, police encounters with civilians, is resisting arrest that big of a problem from the police officer's perspective to the point where we need more enforcement by making this a felony?
Well, my experience has been is that, of course, 100 Blacks in Law Enforcement Who Care, we're pro-enforcement, we're against crime and criminality. But what we see by this particular law is that it's an overkill on behalf of the police department, sometimes the legislatures. If you look at the small percentage of police officers responsible for, charging defendants with resisting arrest, it's like 5% of police officers
are responsible for about 40%.
So it becomes,
charges.
as was just stated, it becomes an additional excuse or explanation when the officer has been abusive to a defendant. He'll just tack on that charge in order to justify if the individual had an injury or, in order to justify arrest. So when it's used correctly, no problem. When individuals legally resist the police officers, reasonable arrest or legal arrest, no problem. But what we see is an overkill in terms of this particular charge. And we see a very small percentage of police officers using this as what we feel to be an explanation. That's not only what the statistics say, but that's also what my personal experience has observed.
Now, one thing that's interesting is that NYPD has used resisting arrest charges, or the amount of resisting arrest charges that a police officer may submit throughout their career, as an indicator that that police officer may be an abusive cop. So my question is, if we're using the increase or the amount of resisting arrest charges as an indicator to spot a bad cop, why then are we increasing the penalty for resisting arrest when sometimes these charges aren't legitimate to begin with? Marty.
The problem in my experience is that the charges are not legitimate. To tack on resisting arrest to, for example, in my case, I represent thousands of demonstrators, people who get arrested, generally for disorderly conduct. The police will attach a resisting arrest charge, and you look at the complaint and it says the person made handcuffing difficult. So if you've got making handcuffing difficult, that becomes the misdemeanor crime. These people want to increase that to a felony because somebody made handcuffing difficult? The other problem is that I've seen in arrest demonstrations too many videos where I've got a potential client, the defendant, who's down on the ground, being handcuffed, and the police are standing over him saying, "Stop resisting arrest, stop resisting arrest," and the person is doing nothing, absolutely doing nothing. And that person winds up being charged with a misdemeanor. In those situations, the cases are generally thrown out. Occasionally, we get a district attorney who recognizes that there are some ground rules that have to be paid attention to in actually charging somebody in court. So resisting arrest rarely makes it into court in demonstration cases because it's so often tacked on as something where an officer who's doing the arrest finds the person annoying. And being annoying does not get you a misdemeanor charge. And these folks want to make it a felony. Felony's a serious business. You know, they have serious consequences, not only including jail terms. If somebody's got a felony on their record, then they have serious disabilities for future employment, future education, future loans, future credit. And it just seems to me to leave too much discretion in the hands of the officer. And that's what 40 years of my experience doing this is. Yeah. That the cops just have too much discretion to add on a rather vaguely worded statute that says if you interfere or attempt to interfere with somebody who's effecting an arrest, then you could be charged with resisting arrest. It's natural for people. When a cop comes up to them and says, "You're under arrest," the person says, "Hey, wait a minute. You know, what did I do? I didn't do anything." Well, that could be interpreted as resisting arrest because the person did not comply originally with a police officer who said, "You're under arrest."
And I want to ask you, in your experience, when you are approaching someone to arrest them, as Marty said, the natural reaction is, wait a second, what am I being arrested for? What's going on? Is that, in your opinion, resisting? Or would you have tacked on a resisting arrest charge for that instance?
No, I wouldn't have tacked on a resisting arrest charge. And that's similar to what you've seen in the Eric Garner case. Verbal judo, what we're taught in the police academy, sometimes it helps appease a potentially volatile situation. If you go a little further to explain to the individual, listen, this is not the appropriate time to protest you being arrested. You know, you put your hands behind your back, and you know, that's something that you didn't see in the Eric Garner case. There was no, although he verbally resisted, and even there was a passive resistance because he just objected verbally to being arrested, but the officers didn't take their time out, in my opinion, when I observed the film, to explain to him, to attempt to encourage him to comply verbally. So, you know, I wouldn't attack on the charge, but many times, and the statistics show that officers are attacking on because you have very small percentages of police officers who add on these resisting arrest charges to their arrest, and I've never done that.
Now, I believe that we are not going to have the senator on. It looks like he may be a little bit busy. But, Andrew, I want to ask you, because you represent individuals who have these tacked-on charges that are tacked on to additional crimes. How is it that you approach resisting arrest charges when it comes to defending them? Because only 6.2% of these cases actually result in convictions.
Right. Well, in the vast majority of my cases, the important thing to remember is that it's not unlawful to resist an unlawful arrest. And that's what most of my cases spring from. It's a bad stop or a bad seizure on the street. And when somebody protests that, when somebody says, "Hey, you have no right to stop me," then the officer uses excessive force and then ends up charging my client with resisting arrest. The criminal case gets dismissed. We end up suing the police officer and often getting a judgment for our client. But it is one element of resisting arrest is that the arrest be authorized. So if the arrest is illegal, then the resistance is legal. And people should be exercising their right to protest injustice. People should be resisting abuse of authority. On the streets, in our legislature, in our schools, everywhere, people should be speaking out about injustice. And injustice on the street is where it all comes from. And it's only happening in some of our communities. You know, it doesn't happen to me, but some of our kids can't walk to school every day without being stopped by the police.
Yeah, and verbal resisting, of course, because we do want to make sure that everyone in the situation does remain safe. Now, what I want to touch on is something that you mentioned, Noel, that a small percentage of police officers are responsible for a large amount of resisting arrest charges. 5% of officers are responsible for about 40% of these resisting arrest charges. What is the danger in that statistic there?
I mean, the danger, the problem is that we're not tracking those officers. The problem is that the NYPD has done a great job over the years of tracking our citizens and tracking their misconduct, but this vast database that they have, they don't track the misbehavior of police officers. They don't track the judgments against the officers in lawsuits. They don't track judicial findings of misconduct or judicial findings of bad searches and seizures. There's no mechanism to report a judge's suppression of evidence for a bad search and seizure to the NYPD. So judges can find officers incredible, not credible as a matter of law day in and day out. It never gets to the police officers' superiors. They never even feel it. They never even know the results of suppression hearings. We have the same handful of officers. We have 35,000 police officers in this city, and we have the same handful of police officers that my firm sees every day. We see them all the time. And a client will come in and he'll have been arrested in the 67th precinct or the 73rd precinct, and he'll name the officers, and we'll know the officers, and we've sued them before. I mean, we've sued generations of officers. We've seen them come up through the ranks in precincts. And it would be a very easy matter for the NYPD to use the statistics at their fingertips to discipline these officers and to create a safer environment for everybody. And maybe legislation toward that, rather than further criminalizing often lawful behavior on the streets, would be the way to go.
So a behavior deterrent, not just with regard to the civilians, but a behavior deterrent with regard to the police officers as well.
You know, increasing the penalty is not going to deter behavior. Nobody thinks through their minds, oh, if I resist arrest, it's going to be a felony, or I resist arrest, it's going to be a misdemeanor.
Would a public campaign help that?
No, it certainly would not. The public campaign, when we passed the Rockefeller drug laws, we made it a serious crime that you get life in jail for peddling drugs. Now, that really cracked down on the drug problem, didn't it? All it did was increase the number of people in our prisons. Right. We've got now a serious mass incarceration issue that is racially based. And it's just a tragedy in the way an entire generation of young black and Hispanic men have been wiped out by the effect of the Rockefeller drug laws. Increasing the penalty for resisting arrest and putting more felonies or potential for felonies on people who are not necessarily criminals. I mean, resisting arrest is not a violent crime. You know, making handcuffing difficult, or the person flailed his legs a little bit. That could result in a resisting arrest charge. To make that a felony is going to criminalize conduct that is normal conduct, that is not serious conduct, it's not serious misconduct. And if the idea is to create a city full of sheep who, whenever a police officer says jump, you say how high, without ever questioning the authority, then maybe we could have a whole city full of sheep. If that would satisfy Commissioner Bratton, or Senator Ravella, then that's not really a society that I'd like to be part of.
Oh, well, thank you guys so much for being here. This is a topic that I think we'll continue to look at, continue to address, and we'll see where that proposed legislation goes from here. Thank you again to my guests for being here.
Thank you, Charisma.
Absolutely.